Launching an EV isn't an easy thing to do for any car maker. Electric cars are shiny, quirky, novel things for the moment, and inevitably quite expensive. If you're a company like Tesla, you can spin that to your advantage, of course. If you're Volkswagen, the biggest car manufacturer in the world, you can afford to set up an all-new family of cars and hope sheer scale will see you through. If you're Mercedes, you can always just say, well, it's a Mercedes, and people might just swallow that.
But what do you do if you're Ford? And generally, you've always sold normal cars to normal people and maybe struggled a bit to make headway into premium luxury car territory. Well, you use what you've got. And the one car that Ford has made for decades now, that people have always been happy to spend quite a lot of money on, is the Mustang. And that's why this car, which is Ford's first big series production battery electric vehicle, and probably the most important production car it's launched in 20 years. That's why it's called a Mustang Mach-E and not a Ford Model E or whatever else they might have called it, because it's a bit expensive. So rather than follow all the other European volume brands and launch a smaller, cheaper, sub £30,000, 150 mile range, small EV, like a Renault Zoe or a Nissan Leaf, Ford's gone bigger and more expensive, and the EV technology in this car necessarily makes it pricier than it might otherwise be. And Mustang, that's the closest thing that Ford has these days to a global premium brand. It's that simple. Think about it. If I told you that this car was a Ford Model E rather than a Mustang, and it cost £58,000, how would your reaction to it be different? Don't worry, I can probably guess. So let's get real. Ford doesn't really think about this car as some sort of four-door high-rise muscle coupe that happens to run on alternating current. It's clearly a mid-sized, swoopy-looking crossover SUV that they're hoping people are going to think is a bit more desirable than the average electric car. And it helps, obviously, that it looks a bit like a Mustang in places. But it's obviously intended to be a lot more usable and practical and real-world than a Mustang coupe ever could be. It's also the beginning of a key transformation for the Ford Mustang from a car into a sub-brand in its own right. Now that might sound like cynical marketing nonsense, and it's certainly the leveraging of an asset, isn't it? But is it any worse, for instance, than turning a Fiat 500 into an MPV? I don't think so. I think it's quite clever, actually, because it's not as if they're replacing the regular Mustang. What they're doing is actually extending its life as far as they can. And they're creating the perfect sort of foil or complementary good for it. I mean, it's only by making electric cars like this in significant numbers that Ford of Europe is going to be able to continue to sell big V8 engine cars like the Mustang for any length of time and for as long as it's allowed to in any case. So these two cars, the regular Mustang and the Mustang Mach-E, they're going to take on this really interesting sort of symbiotic relationship. They kind of allow for the existence of the other. And Ford genuinely thinks there will be people who have both of these cars. They use their Mach-E in the week, they keep their emissions down, they do the responsible thing, they commute in their electric Mustang, and then at the weekends they get out the V8 and really enjoy themselves. I think that's quite a cool idea.
An entry-level Mustang Mach-E will cost you just over £40,000 in the UK. That has one motor, rear-wheel drive, just over 250 horsepower and a drive battery with 68 kilowatt-hours of usable capacity, which gives you a WLTP range of 273 miles. You can get an extended range version with a little bit more power and a bigger battery and a claim range of 379 miles, and for a whisker under £50,000, that range might just get your attention. And then there's this twin-motor version which has four-wheel drive, just under 350 horsepower, and supposedly does just over 330 miles on a charge. 0 to 60 miles an hour comes up here in just over 5 seconds, and that sounds nicely Mustang-y, doesn't it? And then later on comes the full-fat GT version with nearly 500 horsepower, if you want to get really silly.
It's a surprisingly spacious car, this, There's a lot more room in it than you think there's going to be, particularly legroom and headroom in both rows, actually. And you could probably squeeze 3 across the second row there if you had to. It's a bit like a Jaguar I-Pace like that. There's sort of more room in it than you expect. There's a good size, I think, 400 litre boot at the back, and at the front there's a separate boot which has drain holes, so you can stick wet stuff or dirty stuff in there and then just hose it all out and the water drains out. I think that's quite a neat idea. The interior is nice enough. It's perhaps not finished in a way that other £60,000 luxury cars might be. You know, some of the materials are a bit sort of parts bin forward. Some of the leathers aren't particularly impressive, I have to say. But there are nicer elements too. This sort of double bubble dash with a sort of cloth trim on it, I quite like that, and that's a Mustang thing. This 16-inch portrait infotainment system, massive as it is, that clearly isn't a Mustang thing, that's a Tesla thing. And it doesn't have a web browser on this one, unlike Tesla's, but it does have Ford's latest sync infotainment software on it, which is quite impressive. It's got a fully networked navigation system, so it'll tell you all of the available charging stations that you may need on your route. And while I think about it, so the car has an 11 kilowatt onboard charger for home charging, so typically it'd probably be a good overnight charge from empty. But while you're out and about, it will do DC rapid charging at up to 150 kilowatts, which is pretty fast. So you could drive the thick end of 300 miles, stop for an hour, plug it into a 150 kilowatt charger, and probably have most of your battery charge returned to it for another 250 miles thereafter. I mean, how many of us need to drive further than that in a day? Not very many, I suspect. So the car has 3 driving modes. In any of them, you can switch on and off sort of this one pedal driving mode if you like to do that sort of thing, if you like to drive an EV without really using the brake pedal much. That's fine. The driving modes themselves do have some slightly cringy titles. So the standard one is active, which is fine, it's default. You've then got whisper, which isn't really much quieter than active, is it? It's an electric car, it's going to be quiet. And then the mad sporty one is called Untamed. Off it goes. Exciting. You can imagine, can't you, the sort of domestic conversations that would queue up. It'd be like, oh dear, the electric bill has come this month and it's a little bit high. Have you been driving the Mustang in untamed mode again? Yes dear, guilty as charged. I just can't help myself, you know, it's so exciting. So, is it really exciting? Well, yes and no. The car has a sort of a medium firm ride. It's fairly fast, you know, it's not Tesla ludicrous fast, but you put your foot down, it takes off, it's got plenty of go. And there's obviously a faster one coming, so we'll leave that for now. Yeah, it feels heavy. It rides like a big heavy car. Doesn't maybe handle quite so much like one. When it's disturbed on a surface like this, it's sort of, you know it moves around quite a lot and it feels a little bit sort of burly and firm. But when you begin to take corners in it, it actually feels quite precise and quite competent, but it's not sort of naturally agile or incisive or anything like that. I mean, Ford claims to have aimed for a rear-wheel drive feel to the handling balance, to the chassis balance. I've only been driving it on the road today, but I think you have to drive it pretty hard, harder than you would, certainly on a day like today, on the road, to really know if there is any sort of rear-wheel drive feel to the chassis. It is, you know, it is certainly nicely balanced enough, and the body control is there. It just feels like a big heavy car, as these EVs always do. No matter what they do with the battery, where they put it, how clever they are, you know, weight is weight, and you can't really hide it completely. This is a nice car to drive. It isn't really a sports car, you know, it's not really fooling anybody. It's got a little bit of Mustang-y flavour to it, mostly because you can turn on, what do they call it, propulsion sound, and then it begins to play what sounds quite a lot like V8 engine noise to you. It certainly sounds more like engine noise than you get in a lot of EVs, which sound a bit more like the Millennium Falcon or one of those weird sort of theremin musical instruments that you have to play by waving your arms around. You know, it sounds mostly like a Mustang, and there's probably just enough handling poise in it for it to feel a little bit like a Mustang at times. You know, the truth is, this Mustang Mach-E is the car it needs to be. It's the sort of electric car that an interested driver might naturally seek out. And that does the job, doesn't it? You know, there's this school of thought building amongst enthusiasts that says EVs are never going to be any good to drive, really. But it doesn't matter, because as long as everybody who doesn't care about cars buys an EV, as long as they're good enough for those people, for everybody else, then maybe the rest of us, because we're such a small minority, the rest of us can stick with our combustion engines and our drivers' cars, and everything will be okay. And that's a slightly concerning perspective, and we have to watch it, because it's much too simple to be true. Primarily because, of course, cars like the Porsche Taycan and the Lotus Evija exist, and they are clearly drivers' cars, and you would enjoy driving them. And this one, you know, this might not be a sports car, it might not really be a Mustang, but you would enjoy driving it. Trust me, you would. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.